Welcome to Guitar Knobs Podcast. Guitars, gear, noise, and nonsense. And we are doing our part 2 with amp builder Dave Harris. And is it okay if I call you an amp builder?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
fair.
what you do, right?
I've earned that one.
You have. We're going to take a listen to what this very special amp can do. Mark? Ooh, that was
pretty.
nice.
Very
Give us something with a little edge real quick.
Yeah, sure.
Nice.
I love the hand motion after the power chords.
Yeah, it's really, yeah. You're
We're dealing.
we're dealing.
That's it. We're dealing.
So, okay, first and foremost, I encourage you to listen to part 1 of this interview first, as it will give you a lot more context. Part 1, we talked about Dave's backstory, had a couple demos, and just got a general understanding of like what makes this amp special. And it's not just this one amp. I mean, we are demoing one amp, which is the model.
It's the model TAF 30.
TAF 30. Mm-hmm. And obviously, Dave, you've got a wide range of amps that you build, custom build. So when I'm referencing this amp, it's just happens to be the one in this room, but we're referring to your approach to amp building. For this podcast, part 2, we're going to do a little bit more of a Q&A. So we've heard your backstory. We got a little bit of information on where you're coming from. And we have questions that fellow guitar players and some of the other knobs who are not present are going to have been asking us. So today we're hearing from these knobs.
Jeff Fischer.
Dave Harris.
Todd Novak, and guest knob guitar player extraordinaire,
Marc DiCenzo, hello.
Marc DiCenzo, who runs Circa Music. Go visit them at circamusic.com.
Please do. You're always welcome.
All right, let's get into this, all right?
All right.
We're going to get some questions going. So whether we like it or not, as much as we're focusing on tone and how special a hand-wired amp can sound, it's kind of like anything else. It's like a really great-looking car. You might forego the actual driving experience for a great-looking car. I'm just curious. Obviously, you have an aesthetic that you go with right out of the box. Do you get many requests for custom cabinetry or different styles of how you approach your aesthetic?
Oh, we get an occasional question about what could be done to design the cabinet a little differently. Sometimes we don't cover them with Tolex, for example, and give them a hand-rubbed wood finish. We've also had people request special Tolex, special coverings that is suitable for their particular people. Got a country western covering that looks like embossed leather. Another one that's simulated alligator skin, and it goes very well down south. And so, we can do those sorts of things. And also, we occasionally get questions about how we might enhance the tone in one particular way. I had one fellow that wanted it to be almost brittle in its sound at some points, very, very high frequency, and found a way to do that very nicely in the feedback loop so that the highs are very much emphasized, and it makes the guitar sound almost like you're playing on glass strings. It's very, very sharp.
That's
and
interesting.
shrill, but it's a good sound.
So when someone is asking you for a certain sound, how do you take that, what they're asking for, and think about it in an electronic way? Like the idea of a brittle sound, you say, oh, I could do X, Y, or Z.
Well, I realize that a brittle sound comes to mind, breaking glass, much high frequency, and crisp high frequency, no distortion on it, but nice and crisp. So there are ways of doing that by shaping the feedback in the amplifier. If you don't send negative feedback for the high frequencies at the same intensity as you do for the low frequencies, then they appear to be boosted. And that's essentially what you have on a presence knob on your Marshall. But I did it with a vengeance with a sharper cutoff. And it's a neat sound. We've done that a couple times.
You've demystified the presence knob. That was a total bonus.
All it is a high frequency feedback is cut off. You have inverse feedback holding the amplifier's gain down and preserving the fidelity of the input signal. And if you turn the presence knob on, you're putting a capacitor across those high frequencies, and they don't get back into the amplifier for negative feedback. So it's more shrill, more brittle.
One thing we're not going to do is ask you for your 11 herbs and spices. So
I don't know if I can really answer that. Anyhow, I will say that finding the appropriate audio output transformers was a bit of a task. And I bought from the vendors in the United States the various devices. I didn't go to some of the super high-priced ones because I'm not going to pay $200 for an output transformer. And of course, part of that's being spoiled by the fact that they were $16 when I was a kid.
Price has gone up a little bit.
Price has gone up a little bit. So a number of Chinese people said, hey, we make you a prototype and you can try it out and see what you think. And I found one guy that seemed very cooperative, and he made me some samples to my spec, and I tested them, and it didn't meet spec. And I told him, he said, no problem. Tell me what went wrong, I'll fix it. And he did. Nice. And on the third pass, we had a really nice audio output transformer. So I've stuck with that vendor. And that's part of the sound. There's no doubt about that. A good output transformer is very important. It has to match the tube through the impedance range, and that's kind of a trick when you look at what's going on there, reflecting back from the speaker to the plate of the tube. It has to look right at any frequency.
So what kind of tone does a transformer impart on the sound? Like,
well,
what should you listen for?
If you look at the waveform, as you go through the spectrum,
in an oscilloscope, correct?
With an oscilloscope, yeah, you will see distortion in your sine wave at some frequencies, and this can create second harmonic distortion or third harmonic distortion. It definitely affects your sound, and what I was looking for in the beginning was pure sound. I wanted to see if it was going to saturate. I wanted it to saturate both the positive and negative at the same time. And as I went through the spectrum, I didn't want to see that sine wave shift in its form. I want it to stay pure. Another way you can look at it is with a square wave. If you put a square wave in and your transformer is not wound properly, you can see ringing on the waveform. A line goes straight up and it rings, and then it comes down and it rings on the bottom. And this is adding distortion too. It sometimes is due to an instability in the plates because the impedance isn't really quite right at that frequency. So I look for all these things when I'm picking an audio transformer out, and my ear now can tell me right away what kind of distortion I'm getting without looking at the scope. But when I put the scope on, I say, yeah, there it is. And so you have to tune that out.
So you basically use it as another tool in the arsenal of tube building to create a tone using a transformer.
Yeah, the transformer is an important part, and of course the other factor that people don't talk about much is power transformers. Once again, a sticker shock hit me. I looked at power transformers used to be $20, they're $100.
Yeah,
and I said, well, wait a minute, there's got to be a better way. And so I began to explore some things that we've been playing with in our circuitry for industrial electronics. And one of the things we do quite frequently is use a voltage multiplier. We'll take a transformer and put a special solid-state rectifier circuit in it that will put out 1.4 times the input or 2.8 times the input. And so with that, you can buy a transformer that's supposed to basically be an isolation transformer. And you put 120 in, you get 120 out. Well, you put that into a voltage doubler, and it's 2.8 times 120. Bingo, we're up at plate voltages for 6V6s and 6L6s. And these are much less expensive transformers.
Yeah,
they don't have a filament winding. But fortunately, you can still buy a filament transformer. So most of my amps use that technique, and the reduction in the weight of the iron necessary is significant.
That's what I was going to say. Is that why we're dealing with a much smaller cap? Yeah. Brilliant.
And I thought I'd invented that, and then I looked at the PV Classic 30, and they've been doing it all along. So, but they do some other things that I would never do. I won't go into that.
Yeah, that was actually part of a question was, you'd mentioned before, you use a lot of the vintage style circuitry from when it all started, basically.
Yeah.
And are you thinking like they got it right the first time and you don't need to mess with the what they've created?
Oh, no. I'm saying that if we're listening for the classic sound, that we want to use the classic design and incorporate and allow it to have the distortion that it had in the beginning. In those days, we were trying to eliminate all the distortion we could. And it was a pretty clean amp, but it wasn't perfect high fidelity. And you get a perfect high fidelity amplifier and play your guitar through it, and you say, that's sterile. It just doesn't have any character.
Right.
It's like a computer generated voice. It's not there.
So do you think your amplifiers have a signature voice to them?
Yeah, they do. And the closest I've been able to come to what that is I had a fellow buy one of my amplifiers down in the Cincinnati show. He wandered up and he said, can I play your amp? And I said, oh, sure. Handed him a guitar and he started playing. He got this beautiful grin on his face and he said, I'll take it. He didn't even ask how much it was.
Yeah. I mean, there is a beauty to that, right? I'm sure, Mark, you experience that all the time.
So I knew he must
too.
really have something going. Well, I heard from him later and he says, I wanted to explain myself. When I was a youngster up in Minneapolis, I took lessons from an old fellow who had a pair of amplifiers that Leo Fender had hand-wired himself. I've been looking all my life to find that sound, and when I played your amp, I heard it.
That's awesome.
So, wow.
Yeah.
That's what I was trying for.
That's cool. That's very cool. That
That's
magic of guitar meets amplifier, and in your head, that's the tone you want it, and you've captured it.
Yep.
It's got to be a great feeling.
And it's important to note in that story is that this is a person who's actually played one of Leo Fender's amps and is not just thinking he's hearing it on a recording. It's a person who's heard one in person and performed through one. I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about what Fender amps and what Marshalls, and depending on which range we're talking about, actually do. And in my experience, that this amplifier, when we can talk about a price point later on, is doing exactly what the 50s and early 60s Fenders and mid 60s, late 60s Marshalls, which as far as I know, are based on those Fenders, and even some ranges like matchless and high watt. Very similar performance, very high quality performance, might I add.
So the idea that kind of all these amps share parts and pieces and tonalities, right? Somebody develops one, and someone then takes that and starts something else with maybe a little tweak or different tone to it, right?
As far as I know, isn't the original Marshall amplifier, just a complete copy off of the 59 Bassman, which is why those are all so coveted?
I've heard that.
I mean, sorry, Marshall, if I'm. I don't.
But Marshall then invested in some remarkable technology to create new distorted sounds.
Yeah,
and I've looked at that, and that has had an influence on my two-face amps. So,
and which I've had a chance to play through, and they're wonderful. They're really cool, different. I prefer my amp, which is why I have it. But
you shouldn't use a two-face. You don't need it, Mark. You can do it.
You don't need another one.
You can make all the beautiful sounds just the way they should be without it. Some fellows don't know how to do that.
I've been fortunate to have been able to play on some very expensive amplifiers in my time, and very few of them were mine. And I've also slogged through in a lot of inexpensive amplifiers, and I have my expectations somewhat balanced in terms of what I would expect for a certain price point, or at a certain level of, collectability. Maybe, there's some reasons why the classics became the classics, because they do a certain thing very well. And just to echo the gentleman from Cincinnati, this is a real amplifier. I mean, I don't mean that lightly, that this is it is an amplifier that if you expect Leo Fender era, pre-CBS era, which the CBS stuff isn't bad either. If you have expectations in terms of performance, you will get that from this amplifier. And the price point just blows my mind, but that's once again a discussion for a different time.
I think it's worth also mentioning that, and we just briefly grazed this on part one, and I wanted to bring that back up, which was, I think, especially if you're a beginning musician, or even trying to change up, like, I want to change up my sound or whatever. Well, what do you want it to sound like? What do you want your sound to sound like? Most people are going to say, I want it to sound like it's coming from this amp or this. I want to sound like a Vox. I want to sound like a Marshall. I want to sound like a Fender. And something that is really special about this is this sounds like your guitar or you're playing. The amp isn't taking over
right
your style or your favorite guitar or your pickup selection. And that's relatively unique. I think maybe that was one of the things that really grabbed my attention. I'm like, that doesn't sound like a Fender. It doesn't sound like a Marshall. It doesn't sound like a Vox. It sounds like the guitar. And that was a revelation for me.
And really, depending on the speakers and the speaker cabinet, you can get close to other guitar amps. And if you want those, go buy them.
Yeah.
But any style of music.
So speaking of that, why don't we hear what an Epiphone Sheraton 2 semi-hollow body sounds like?
Yeah. Can you get that plugged in?
Technical difficulties. Too many wires. When are we going to get rid of the wires? That's going to be the interesting.
Shouldn't be hard to do.
Did you just lick the cable?
What happened?
Oh no! I was repositioning myself.
Oh, I thought he, like when people write.
No, I didn't lick the lead.
That's crazy.
That reminds me of a great story, because I used to entice my kids to put it on their tongue, like it's going to shock them.
Yeah.
So I would put it on my tongue and like fall back like, and I was like, you guys try this. You guys try this. And they're all terrified to put it on their tongue.
Sheridan.
Yay.
Yay for the Sheraton too, and for Mark, and yay for the amp.
TF30R.
So there are many different types of tubes, right, to create different types of tonalities, right? And the tube is like a transformer where you're picking your pieces and matching them together to do certain things. And without going deep into like all the different type of tubes, and there's some basic ones that are used on almost all guitar amps, right? My question is, have you ever tried using some exotic type of tube that maybe is cast aside, or most people don't look at it as a unique sound?
Yeah. I started out looking at exotic kinds of tubes when I came back in because I couldn't believe what they were asking for the tubes.
Oh, yeah, they're so pricey anymore.
We use every day, and I've watched them in the last 8 years double in value. It's incredible. And so, yes, I have used some exotic tubes, and one of the things I've experimented with is some of the old transmitting tubes that we used in ham radio. Most of them require a lot of voltage in order to begin to work well, and I could do that, but I don't think that's a real good plan. And another exotic approach was the output transformerless design. That used no output transformer at all, and used big power triodes that were used to control servo motors and things of that nature.
That's interesting.
And I built one up that was in a year 1972 handbook, and it delivers 25 watts from 5 hertz to 50,000 hertz.
What 50,000 hertz?
5 hertz, you feel. 50,000 hertz is way out of our hearing range.
Yeah.
You and I can probably hear up to
But the amplifier
17.
would do this, and it truly was high fidelity in the truest sense of the word. And one of the weakest links in an audio system is the matching of the output tubes through the transformer to the speaker. So if you eliminate the transformer, you have one of the lossiest and most difficult elements taken away. And it's possible to get tone response over that kind of range if your speaker can handle it. Of course, your speaker can't handle 50 kilohertz anyhow. You could put a crossover network, and there are some electrostatic elements that will do that. But the idea was to build one without a transformer and to evaluate it. And as I said, though it's a very interesting amplifier, it's a sterile guitar amplifier.
It might be good for powering speakers in, say, a mastering engineer's studio, though. That would be a very accurate.
There are people who buy them.
Yeah.
And they're outrageously expensive, too. $3,000 or $4,000 will buy you a 25-watt amplifier.
Yeah. Actually, the idea of building an audiophile style amplifier, I'm sure you've probably been asked to do that many times as well, too.
I haven't been asked too many times. I have played with it, but and my one son would love for me to do that.
Yeah.
He thinks that's where the real money is. I know that there's an outfit down on Huntley Road that's building $30,000 amplifiers with tubes and transmitting tubes at that we used to use for ham radio. But I don't see that as my calling. The relating the music and the electronics, and especially with young artists who are developing their feel for the music and their vision for the music for the future. This is where it's at.
Yeah, it's a beautiful sentiment, actually.
Mm-hmm.
That was a beautiful sentiment. It was even more beautiful that you said it was a beautiful sentiment.
Beautiful. Cheering up. So we talked a little bit about solid-state amps in the first example and how the transistor came along and kind of changed things for power standpoint. Can you tell us a little bit or explain a little bit about when I listen to 5 watts of a tube amp versus 5 watts of a solid-state amp? There's such a volume difference.
I think most of the time it's because of the speaker that they've paired up with the amplifier. especially when you're looking at combo amps that are sold to students and the lower priced entry into the field. People seem to have decided that it's not necessary to spend any money on a good Celestion or Eminence or whatever. They just put a run-of-the-mill speaker in the box, and it probably has an efficiency of 89 decibels or 92 decibels per watt, and so it's not very loud. But solid state amplifier people tend to buy into that because they also make 200 watt amplifiers, and hey, 94 decibels is plenty loud.
That's true.
So I think you're listening as much to the speaker quality. But then the other thing is that when we rate our tube amps, we're rating them for a sound that is a sine wave. It's an undistorted sound, and a lot of solid state amps just say, well, how much can I push out of the speaker? And it's no ways near that much.
Okay, that might be the difference right there, right?
That's one of the differences. Yes,
because I know I need like 200 to 500 watts for my bass amp to even start to kick in, right?
Yeah,
and in a guitar amp, that's ridiculous, right? That's way too loud to stand next to. So there's that difference of maybe how it's classified from a wattage standpoint and how it's defined by the industry.
And you may find that your speaker is a very low efficiency, but very clean on the low end, and has excellent attack and no resonances. But at the same time, it's not really efficient, and so you need more power.
Yeah, makes sense.
And as we explained, every 3 dB, you double your power.
Mm-hmm. That's actually a really, I'm going to use that for a segue here. So somebody who's interested in buying one of your amps, and I will, let me make a disclaimer really quick. Guitar Knobs is in no way affiliated in any way, shape, or form, legally or financially, with Dave's company, the Tube Amp Factory.
Unless we get free amps.
No, it's not even.
No,
it isn't.
No, it's not part of that.
I just disclaimed it. Now you reclaimed it.
Unless we get free amps. I'll say it again. Okay.
We are not affiliated. We are doing this simply because we appreciate what he's built and how amazing they sound. We want everybody else to hear that too. So my segue here is that if I was going to be purchasing an amp from you, whether it's right off your site or a custom build, it's the head. It's the power unit. So for someone who may not have like you and Jeff and even Mark have a much greater understanding of when you start talking about speakers. But man, I really want that amp. So what can you suggest for me who wouldn't know exactly what to do about how to pair up the right speaker or speakers? Mm-hmm. How do you go about that? So I just got an amp from you. Now what?
We have to ask what you're going to do with the amp. Are you using this as a student to practice with? Mm-hmm. Are you playing for a church group? Are you going out and playing coffee houses? Are you with a band that has 3 more guitars and a bass and a drummer? And this defines what sort of amplifier you need and what sort of speaker configuration you should use. Because even the little 10-watt amplifier is very loud into an efficient 412 cabinet. It's incredibly loud. A whole symphony orchestra, I've been told, puts out 5 watts of pure audio.
Wow.
At crescendo.
It's interesting.
So
there you go.
That's pretty loud.
Yeah.
Which is why anybody who's been to a concert in the 1970s when they were using thousands of watts, I don't know how anybody can hear from that generation.
Well, most of us can't hear anymore.
So you mentioned that, aside from deciding what kind, so let's say I said, hey, I'm going to be doing small, like bar gigs. Uh-huh. What are some of the important things to consider when, if you say, great, here's your amp, good luck at those barroom gigs, you might want to consider, if you're getting a cabinet, X, Y, and Z. What are some things to consider when you are looking for the right cabinet to pair up with any one of your amps?
Well, as I said in the beginning there, it's that efficiency number that is primary. If you don't have the efficiency in the speaker that's in that cabinet, it's not going to work very well for you.
Okay.
And
can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
Well, a speaker that has, if you look at one of my favorites is the Celestion Classic 30, and it typically is a 101 decibels for 1 watt of power input at 1 meter. And that's a very efficient speaker. They do get a little more efficient, but not much. And then to compare that to a speaker that I would buy that's a brand X, maybe designed for public address service, or somebody says it's a full-range guitar speaker, and I say, well, what's the efficiency? And they say, well, I don't know, and let's look it up, and it comes out 92 decibels. Now, between 92 decibels and 101 decibels, you have triple the power.
Right, so, but the layperson doesn't understand that.
Yeah.
Like, I would be like 92, 100, yeah, that's pretty close.
Yeah. But no, it would be, it would make, if you took a 10-watt amplifier and put it into the 92 decibel, and then you went to a 95 decibel, that 10-watt amplifier would sound like 20 watts. And then you go the next step up, and it would be 40 watts, and we still haven't gotten to the Classic 30, which would make it sound like 80 watts. So
wow.
That's real important, and it's you have to dig. The people that are selling junk and calling it speakers won't tell you that, and some of them put them in the cabinets too.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful. You say, what speaker is that? What are its specifications? What does its frequency response look like? And then you can look at the cabinet.
Mm-hmm. And Tube Amp Factory does pair with your combos and with cabinets as well. You do pair speakers.
Yeah, we when we put a combo in, we're looking at a speaker that's going to perform really well, definitely in the higher sensitivity range, so that when you're taking a single 12 in, you're still going to get plenty out of it. And then I've had a number of people ask me to make an extension speaker for them, and that's another way to go. That way they're not so heavy. But the TAF 14 XR is a great little combo, and that has a 101 decibel speaker in it.
So you also mentioned that all your amps are hand wired, point to point.
All of my amps have been hand wired up until this last year. I began making the two-face series, and that is based loosely on some of the Marshall designs. These have a lot of interconnections between small components, and they don't lend themselves as well to going from a tube socket pin to another tube socket pin, because we may go out of one resistor into another resistor and capacitor, and then another capacitor, and then go into the tube. And so what are you going to do? You got to have terminal strips there, or a turret board or something to hook all those up.
So you're saying that it actually affects the tone, or is it just more of
it can. Obviously, if you do a layout and you're not paying attention to what the circuit is doing, you can put an input too close to an output, which will cause oscillations. You can put an input too close to a high voltage line, and the amp will work fine for about a year, and then the circuit board starts to break down and arc, and you take it in, and they say, oh, yeah, we've seen that before.
So it's really just good circuit design in
general. So
general.
part of it's circuit design. And I'm of the opinion that printed circuit boards should not be used where we're asking for a wide range of temperature fluctuation. For instance, when you plug a tube in, a power tube like a 6L6, it gets hot enough to give you a serious burn if you touch it. And if that's going down onto the printed circuit board and conducting heat down into it, after a year or two, you look and around the sockets, all the pins are blackened and browned, and the foil begins to loosen, and you give printed circuits a bad name.
Right.
You shouldn't do that with a printed circuit. So my hybrid idea has been brought out in the two-phase 22 and the two-phase 44, where the tone controls, the volume control, the input jack, and all that is on a little printed circuit board. And then each tube goes up through a simple connector and a 6-wire computer-grade connector that connects onto the board. So you have about 2 inches of wire from the tube socket to the board, and it plugs into that little connector, and then all the high voltage and the filaments and all that stuff is hardwired onto the tubes, just like the old days.
Yeah.
And I think this way we'll overcome almost all those difficulties, and we shouldn't. I'm not noticing any difference in tone. I may start to do that with the other amps as my eyes are getting tired at 74 years old. It's hard work.
Hey, Dave, and last time I was at your shop, I saw you make a circuit, a PCB for a vibrofraz.
Vibrofraz, right.
And I saw it dipped in, I believe, acetone right in front of me. Is that true? Is it?
Well, no, we clean them with a lacquer thinner that sometimes has some acetone in it.
Oh, okay. And but you print those in your shop too, right?
Yeah, we etch them with ferric chloride, and we have a positive photo process where we can actually print out the tape drawing, as we used to call it, because we used to lay out all those lines with little pieces of tape. To computer-generated design, and then lay it out and print it out, and then we can make a printed circuit board from it right there in the shop.
Which I think is important to note, that even if you are getting something with a printed circuit board, which is definitely in the last 20, 30 years developed a bad reputation to guitar players, you're not getting something that was, printed over and over again in some sort of automated process. You're actually still getting a hand printed.
That's a good point.
Board.
Yeah, right at the present. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so there's a lot more quality control, and you're still getting maybe whatever your inferred loss of soul or absence of craftsmanship is in that PCB. It's still there.
Yes, it still is.
It's probably a member of your family doing it.
Yeah, because if I was to feed that into my CAD program and say, okay, lay out this circuit board for me, I would get something very similar to what I see with a commercial amplifier. And I would never accept that layout. I would never want to put those voltages or currents on the board. I would never want to run those lines next to one another. So when I lay it out, I go in there and each component is carefully placed with a consideration for what signal is going to be on it, how far away it is from the nearest other signals, and like I say, I don't run the dangerous stuff through it. I don't put the high voltage on it, and I don't put the high current on it. So the board ought to last forever.
That's an interesting point, because I think, what we're touching on right now with these printed boards, there's a movement in the guitar world right now where we're seeing a lot of people buying things to do home CAD, to print their own boards. Actually, our drummer is one of these guys, and the idea of saying, knowing that, like, the difference between something that you can get off the internet for a program to print a board, but then knowing that has issues with it, just from your experience and testing and pushing, is a really interesting thing, because I think people get into some of those things and they think, well, I can do it, and then it doesn't work, and then they don't know why.
Right. There's a little more to it than just applying the program and getting a result. And will that work? Well, probably. Will it be reliable? Almost certainly not. And we learned that the hard way with years of building circuits and sending them out into the steel industry and the tire industry and these plants that really abuse the gear. And if it's not built right, it won't last. And so That's where the experience has made it possible to make a printed circuit work properly, and to know where you should use a printed circuit and where you shouldn't.
Interesting.
Now, and this last question from me regarding the printed circuit is, I, just because I'm a bit of what they call a noob, I have a hard time sorting out issues with a printed circuit, just because I'm not exactly sure what I'm looking at. If I'm trying to maintain or maintenance something that is hand wired or point to point, I can usually just figure it out with my lack of knowledge to what the issue is. So I can either take it to a shop or attempt to fix myself. Do you think it's just lack of knowledge on my part that makes it harder to maintenance something with a printed circuit? Or is it something that with a little bit more woodshedding and a little bit more reading, I could probably pick up that ability?
Well, there again, it comes back somewhat, Mark, to the person that designed that board. If that circuit designer designed the board and placed the components relative to one another in the circuit, it's just as easy to follow as point to point, because you know you're coming in an amplifier at one point, and you have coupling capacitor, and you have a load resistor, and then you go out through another coupling capacitor, and things move in an orderly fashion. If you plug that all into an auto router program and it says zip bang, there's your layout, the computer has no sense of what that circuit's supposed to do. All it does is connect the lines like it was told, and so it's almost impossible to troubleshoot it.
Yeah, that's been my experience. Whenever I see that little green board, I'm like, dang it.
Yeah. Well, my board, as it ends up, is going to be 6.5 inches long by 1.25 inches wide, and that basically has all the tiny components on it and the pots. And so you loosen the nuts on the pots and you unplug the board, and you can hold it in your hand and look at it. But the most of the circuitry, the important stuff, is all hardwired. Yeah. So I think it's going to work well.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of its performance and sound, I
don't think
certainly
you'll hear any
dispelled
difference.
some of my maybe my sort of long-standing maybe worries or pretensions against the PCB amplifier, or at least the parts of it. I think it changed my mind, nonetheless.
Hey, speaking of tone stacks.
Oh, yeah?
Yep.
Just got a question about tone stacking.
We were talking about tone and how you would capture the essence of tone as someone was explaining it to you. And you mentioned, well, for more of this brittle sound, I would basically increase a presence or an element of presence. And I noticed on the amps, very minimal amount of controls, tone controls. Can you talk a little bit about your philosophy in the tone controls? Is it like when they're all set to 12 o'clock, that is pure guitar signal, no modification?
Right. What I should see when I have my amplifier set at 12 o'clock is I should be able to put a square wave into it, and it will stay square through the whole tone range. And what you see as you turn up the treble is you'll see it peak on the transitions up and peak on the transitions down. And if you turn up the bass, you'll see it round and distort in that manner. Or if you turn it down, you'll see it begin to differentiate, and your square wave won't be level anymore. It'll start to tip over. So that's a check that verifies that your amplifier can go straight through.
Okay.
And it's like hitting the bypass button on your pedal. You should be hearing exactly what the guitar is doing, and with those at 12 o'clock, you should be hearing exactly what the guitar is doing. So then you want to emphasize it, fine.
So then you're picking how do you pick your frequency range for your tone sets?
Well, to be honest, I've taken a classic design that I've used since 1956.
Okay.
That was one of the circuits I just kept.
Yeah.
And I'm not real happy with my mid-range control on the amps I've put mid-range on. I'm still looking at that.
Yeah, because it's interesting. We're looking at across the room, there's a Mesa Boogie. I think it's a Mark V.
Yeah, Mark V. Or Mark IV. That's a Mark IV. And that's a 71 Vibrolux, Silverface Vibrolux.
And there's like how many knobs on there?
Oh, well,
12, 13 knobs.
The Mesa Boogie is a Swiss Army knife. That's it almost has too much that you can do to it. I've had access to that amplifier for 18 years, and so I have a handle on it, but it's still a lot to consider. The Vibrolux, on the other hand, it's the tone controls are almost the same.
Should be about the same, yeah.
I think of it the same way. And in terms of the mid-range, it's funny that you should mention that. I tend to turn up the volume, but turn the bass and treble almost to zero, and then add from there. And that's how I do it on a Fender amp.
That gives you real mid-range.
Yes, and that's the way I find my tone on this amp. So the way I would have the tone on the Mesa Boogie or find it on there is significantly different in my application, or at least in certain settings of that amp. Anybody who's familiar with that amplifier, there's a lot of ways to approach finding tone. But in this one, I start with my mids, and then I add from the bottom and from the top, and sort of
That's an
treat them like
excellent way
shelves.
to do it. Yeah.
Is there one significant component that you say lends itself to the tone of an amp? Is there one specific element of the amp that you think lends itself to the tone, or is it really the sum of everything?
Well, it really has to be the sum of everything, but assuming you've designed your circuit properly, the most significant element in that circuit is probably your output transformer.
Back to the transformers again.
Yeah, it's back to transformers again. And as I said, I ended up going through a house in China that built 3 different prototypes until they got what I wanted. And we used to do that in this country. You call up a transformer manufacturer and you say, well, here's what I have in mind. And they'd say, okay, we'll build you one up, and you try it. And now they say, well, for $1,200, we'll build you one up, and you try it.
Yeah. You don't want to start winding your own then.
Well, I've thought about that. I've thought about it. But these people in China are doing a good job, and they've earned my business the way American companies used to. And I hope that eventually there are some startups that will start winding transformers in this country again.
I could maybe see some of the there's loads of boutique pickup shops, and that's making has been on its way up and growing in numbers rapidly for several years.
Yeah.
But I could definitely see them maybe entering that game and getting specific.
Yeah, everybody keeps predicting the eventual end of vacuum tube amplifiers, and it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And when people realize that, there really is a market for somebody to be making effective transformers for output stages.
Well, that begs a good question. As you're, you searched for those specific things to make your specific sound for, the amps that you've built in the past. As you're continuing to build forward, are there any specific things that you are trying to push in new directions or to discover?
I don't think so right now. No.
Just keeping it the way.
I'll be listening to my people, listening to the musicians that are playing it, and I'm sure they'll come up with things that they would like me to do, effects loops and build in tremolo. Some of the things that have been asked for, and they're not impossible to do. We tried to pretty much eliminate the need for an effects loop on these amps. One of the reasons they are very pedal friendly is because I operate my tubes in the preamp stages with enough plate voltage.
Yeah, we didn't talk about that one
So
at
you're
all.
saying they're pedal friendly, everyone?
Yes.
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
And a lot of amps won't tolerate that because they've deliberately run low voltage on the preamp tubes, which makes them live a little longer. But it also allows them to break up sooner. So you put a pedal with some gain in it, and it breaks up right away. And you say, but I didn't want to break up. All I wanted was the reverb. So by keeping the voltage relatively high on the preamplifier stages, you can get away with plugging pedals in that have more output than your pickup without blowing it into distortion immediately, and I think that's an advantage. So
that's kind of I know we kind of talked a little bit about this before we even started the interview, but you working on something new right now?
Well, the thing that I'm bringing out right now is the two-faced series, and they're just starting to get out into circulation, and I think they're going to go very well for the musician that wants a little more Marshall, a little more breakup, without having to play real loud, and they will do that. And they'll do that very well. And I am printing the strip there, and I'm probably going to start printing my standard amps in a similar manner, just because of the time it takes. And as more and more amps get sold, I find myself working until 2 and 3 in the morning. And I don't want people to wait too long, but at the same time, I don't want to raise my prices that much either.
Right.
Yeah.
This way we can still provide amps at similar prices and produce them a lot faster. And I don't think you'll be able to tell any difference at all.
What's your favorite? I think unless you guys have anything else you want to ask, I'll outro with this question, and then we'll wrap
Then
it.
we'll outro.
Then we'll outro. We'll double outro. But you have chosen a career that is obviously your passion, and something that you that is a talent as well. To have those three things line up is extremely rare. Most people, if they're lucky, they can tap into one. In doing that and doing it for so many years, can you tell us maybe what the one thing, or maybe a couple of things that is the thing that you love the most to get into? When you're getting ready to build an amp, you're going through the process. What is the thing where you forget that it's 2:00 in the morning?
Well, wiring them, the point-to-point wiring.
That's what you enjoy the most.
I like to do it.
Yeah.
My poor old eyes are having a hard time, but that's what it's making something out of a pile of parts, and something that's going to help people make beautiful music. And I get lost in that. I just do.
Awesome. Well, Dave, thanks so much. We really appreciate this. Hopefully we'll hear, maybe we'll get another demo on a podcast later where we can talk about the two-face.
Yeah,
specifically
bring one of those over sometime so that you can play it. We'll do that anyhow.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah. Mark is saddled up with an SG right now and is going to show us what that does on this fantastic amp from Tube Amp Factory. Yeah,
that's all you can do with it.
Mm-hmm. Oh man, that feedback was great.
Yeah, that's nice.
That's it, guys. Awesome. Thanks so much, man.
Well,
really appreciate it.
My goodness,
Yeah, this is great.
this is wonderful.
Yeah, anybody who's asking for more gain than what you put on these things is